When I first booted up Dragon Quest II, I was impressed. Unlike the previous game, it started with a short cutscene showcasing some intrigue for the plot. The cutscene relays how the previous protagonist went off to found his own kingdom that is now split in three. We then see one descendant of that previous protagonist whose kingdom is being attacked by a mysterious new bad guy. She sends away a single guard to deliver a message to the other kingdoms and the other descendants, asking them to help her kingdom and put a stop to this new threat. The player is then given control of a new protagonist, the Prince of the Kingdom of Laurasia, with the mission to gather together the other descendants and defeat this new threat. It certainly isn't anything groundbreaking, really just rehashing the plot of Star Wars, but it does a lot more than the previous game in setting up the main plotline in-game and getting the player invested in this world early on. I was further impressed as the gameplay actually started up. The graphical quality of the game has been significantly improved. There's a wider variety of enemies. There's a more complicated battling system with multiple foes alongside multiple party members as you bring the other prince and princess along for the journey, and the dungeons aren't just blind mazes. But then, my opinions started to get conflicted as I put together my small adventuring party. The story ends up just tapering off after you get the second party member, and it just becomes a quest to get an increasingly cryptic series of MacGuffins. But you also get a ship to sail the vast oceans, opening up exploration immensely. But this also leaves the way forward overly vague and cryptic. But the world map is huge, containing its own miniature version of the previous map. But that map is largely underutilized, with vast, empty oceans. But more party members makes the player feel more in control of their own power. But this also leaves the inventory management and battle menu navigation about 3 times as clunky and difficult as before. But battles themselves are much more interesting, but ultimately, this game feels conflicted. While it definitely has improved in some ways, mostly it just feels like it's made the previous game bigger, which has only served to grow my complaints with this series. But let's start with what the game does right. All of my previous compliments of the game still stand. The story, while still simple and cliché, is presented in a much more compelling way at the start. The combat is more interesting and varied, with multiple party members and multiple enemies, making battles more complex than just a back and forth. The dungeons especially, while still not that interesting by modern level design standards, are much improved over what they were before. But I'd like to give special attention to the overall structure of the game. In my previous video, I talked about the excessive amount of grinding necessary to get through the last town or so of the game, breaking the core gameplay loop of carefully making your way further and further out into the world. Not only is that late-game level spike sharply decreased in this game, but it is replaced with something much more interesting. The game starts by having the player go from town to town in a mostly linear order, very much in line with the previous game. You may have to collect a new party member or go to a local dungeon, but generally the player is simply asked to chase down one town after another as you build up strength. Then, the player is given a sailing ship, and the entire world opens up. Now the goal is to scour the map searching for new towns, dungeons, etc., stretching your ability to manage resources, while also calling the player to be more proactive in exploration. Rather than simply upping the numbers involved for the late game, this genuinely offers an exciting evolution on the gameplay loop. It's an evolution on gameplay that makes the player feel the power they've amassed. Whereas at the beginning of the game, they might be afraid to even go a few tiles away from the starting castle, by the end, they're scouring the globe, actively searching for the most dangerous areas. It's a way that the game taps into the potential of what its mechanics are capable of that is genuinely really exciting. Now, the implementation still isn't perfect. that. The later gameplay mode could certainly be introduced with more fanfare. As it stands right now, the game just kind of hands you a ship after a very brief quest, and then fails to give the player much direction at all as to what they're now supposed to look for, or why. The game also trades in some classic NES cryptic design, with the final dungeon in particular being unbearably cruel for even the slightest misstep. But both of these are problems endemic to pretty much the entire medium during this era. Ultimately, something that can easily be dealt with using online guides, maps, and wikis. I'm willing to forgive these slights, so long as they don't last too much longer into future games. But then, that leads us to the real problems I have with this game. In my last review, I brought up a series of small complaints I had with Dragon Quest I. In Dragon Quest II, none of these small complaints are addressed at all. The movement is still needlessly stiff, the encounters are still poorly spaced, the inventory management is still clunky. In many ways, these problems are only exacerbated by the new elements. The inventory management in particular was a real pain in my butt in Dragon Quest II. But I'd rather focus on the things that have substantially changed rather than dwell on things I've already complained about. Firstly, the story. As already said, it really just tapers off after you get your first party member. I wouldn't give that much focus to it, the last game certainly didn't have much in the way of story at all, but it's still disappointing given how strong the game's opening was. I'd rather have the game either commit to focusing on story or commit to disregarding story, rather than for the game to just give up halfway through. Secondly, the party members aren't as useful as it feels like they should be. The game is experimenting with giving each party member a defined role, but the game doesn't really commit to this in its design. Both of your party members are magic users, but it takes a while before either of them learn any especially useful spells, so for a lot of the game they both just acted as healers and human shields for my main character. Thirdly, the level of randomness. I think this game has actually shown me that I personally just really hate when the player's actions are tied to random chance. I think Morrowind is a good separate example of this. I press attack, I literally see my sword's hitbox swing through the enemy, but the game still randomly decides that I missed. Not only is this frustrating on an inherent game feel level, there's also nothing I can really do about it. I just have to keep swinging until I hit the enemy. In Skyrim, meanwhile, if my sword misses, I can do something about it. I can change my positioning or timing, I can get a weapon with more reach, etc. In Morrowind, all I can really do is keep swinging my sword until the game finally randomly decides to allow me to actually hit my target. In my last review, I mentioned the save state scumming I used with the sleep spell to get through high-level encounters I would have otherwise been killed by. I am not that ashamed to say that I abused save states even more in this game. Just about every single thing the player can do is tied to a random dice roll, determining whether it actually hits or not. I developed strategies to get past certain encounters, but sometimes the strategy doesn't work. Not because there was anything actually wrong with the strategy, but because the game just randomly decided that it doesn't work this time. What am I supposed to do if I select attack, but the attack just doesn't go through for no reason? How am I supposed to prevent this from happening? How is this meant to be any fun? I think player agency is the real linchpin of this. Dungeons & Dragons is another good counterexample, because it's probably even more random, but I don't have this problem as much in D&D. In D&D, I'm the one rolling the die, so it feels like it's part of my action, even if it's really just as random as Dragon Quest. If I roll low, I can use inspiration or see if any of my co-players can give me advantage. And even if I fail a check, because I am actually doing the math myself, I can use that failed check to gauge my next move. If I rolled high and the check still failed, that tells me that my strategy probably isn't going to work and I should change my approach. In Dragon Quest, if I cast a spell and it misses, that tells me nothing about whether my strategy works or not. Maybe this enemy is immune to that spell, or maybe the game just randomly decided that it doesn't work this time. I have no way of really knowing. Fourthly, and lastly, let's talk about the game's primary appeal. To summarize from my last review, each game has a core essence, a core appeal that everything else is supplemental to. I established last time that the core appeal of Dragon Quest I was in careful, considered exploration of a wide landscape, ensuring careful resource management along the way, but I wondered whether the game's combat really added much to this appeal. Dragon Quest II adds a more complex battle system, and with it I feel the gap between the battling and the game's genuine appeal widen. If the game is about careful exploration and resource management, as I've proposed, then random encounters should be individually short and relatively frequent. Each individual encounter is less important than the cumulative effect of these encounters over the course of the player's journey. If encounters are too long, this has the effect of padding gameplay to an unbearable degree, and if they're too infrequent, then the player won't feel the cumulative effect of encounters on their resources, making gameplay far too easy. If the game is about battles themselves, though, then random encounters should be long and very infrequent. In fact, ideally, encounters shouldn't be random at all. Each encounter should be carefully and purposefully crafted to challenge the player in unique ways. Put another way, the encounters are themselves the destination, with the navigation between encounters just being a prelude to the real gameplay. If encounters are too short, then the player won't be challenged enough in their decisions in battle, and if they're too frequent, then the battles are bound to become repetitive and tedious. Dragon Quest tries to compromise between both of these appeals, and is left with encounters that are both too long and too frequent, and thus is a game that can feel padded and repetitive. Dragon Quest II increases the strategy, but this just has the effect of lengthening the encounters, thus making the game feel even more tedious. The game has many different encounters, each of which require different strategies, but after the second time seeing a unique encounter, there's nothing left to really strategize. I just need to use the same strategy I used the last time I saw this enemy. So, rather than relieve my questions, Dragon Quest II has solidified this inherent tension in the genre's core design. These games can either be about exploration, or they can be about strategy. They cannot be about both, or at least, they cannot use the same gameplay systems for both. If they just had different mechanics for planned encounters than with random encounters, then this tension would resolve itself. Maybe random encounters could just go through automatically. If you have the right equipment or spells, the player gets through them unscathed, but otherwise the encounters would lower your stamina stat, or something similar. Then, once you reach one of the planned combat encounters, your stamina would determine things like your mana or your max health. This is just a potential way that these games could have the best of both worlds. But as it stands, we have this tension, this contradiction between two different appeals. The game ends with one last super hard dungeon. I already mentioned this a bit ago. Following this, and a brief puzzle where the big boss's castle looks like the castle from the beginning of the game, the player is sent on a short boss rush, and finally we confront the main villain. But then, surprise, he was just a pawn of this other guy, the God of Destruction. It's all very campy, but I was definitely having fun. It's neat to see all these unique enemy designs and encounters, though it's a bit of a shame that these kinds of encounters are saved for the very end of the game. Anyway, we beat the big bad, and then the player is given free rein to walk back to the starting castle themselves, except this time with no random encounters. It's not especially fleshed out, with almost every NPC saying the same set of things, but this is still a really cool way the game lets itself tell its story through gameplay, rather than just skipping past it to get to the credits. Finally, we make it to the first castle, and I am crowned the new king. You can't help but wonder what the geopolitical situation is going to look like between our three main characters, but oh well. That's obviously not something that the game is going to focus on. In summary, while this game is a major step up in almost every way, I can't help but feel that it doesn't actually evolve the core game appeal much at all. But hey, the next game is supposed to be considered the very best in the series. At least, it was the one most highly sold at time of its release. So, the question remains, can this next game resolve the tension at the heart of this genre? And if so, how?